Good morning. So we concluded yesterday on page 1158 in Ayin Beis, volume 2, the third oifen, the third type or level of bittul, of selflessness, and that is called Efes Biltecha. Efes is deeper than Ayin, which is Ein Zuloscha. That Oyer, only thing that's felt is Atzmus. It's not that there's an existence of Oyer that's transmitting and reflecting Atzmus, and its entire existence is only due to its source. And if there was no source, it would not exist. But here, the very existence itself doesn't even sense itself as an existence. All it is Atzmus expression. And he explained it with the Shar Yichud V'Amunah that when you look at existence, physical existence, it's a yesh. Its entire existence is the letters and the words that God utters. So, La'elam Hashem dvarcha nitzav b'shamayim, forever, in a permanent and perpetual way, the dvarcha, God's word, is nitzav, is embedded permanently in shamayim, in heaven, and that's what gives it existence. And where these letters and words disappear, if they were to expire, to be removed, the entire existence would cease to be as if it never was there. So on a deeper level, that means that the entire existence is really the koyach halaki, which is simply concealed from us. So the same thing with Oyer, that Oyer also is that way. That Oyer, except with Oyer, it's because the entire existence is not yesh, it's mitzias of Ayin in the first place. So entire mitzias is only Atzmus. And then we learned in the parentheses that the idea of Ein Oid, and I explained that length yesterday, the Ein Oid, that the yesh reveals the infinite distance, or how Atzmus is so beyond us, and the Oyer reveals that there is a source. But the comparison is that Ein Oid means there's nothing but Atzmus. So that's where the comparison is, and we're going to learn about this more now in Tzadik Dalet. But I gave an explanation yesterday. I'm not going to go over it right now. But so we stopped at the end of the parentheses, close to 2/3 down below on page 1158 in Ayin Beis. So now we're going to move back to Tafresh Tzadik Dalet on page 159. It skips. It's not because we're skipping a mimer, because this is printed in a sefer and there's other material in those pages in between. So we're jumping from the last place we learned Tzadik Dalet was 144. We're going to 159. And again, on ayinbeis.com, you can find the PDFs of the texts that we're learning now. So now we're going to learn the third oifen, the words of the Ayin Beis, with the Frierdiker Rebbe's elaboration, as I said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, basically around 7 pages of explanation on this half a page that we just learned at Ayin Beis yesterday and the day before. So, interestingly, look what this mimer is called. Efes Biltecha. The last mimer was called Ein Arech Lecha Be'elam Hazeh Ve'ein Zuloscha Malkeinu L'chaya Elam Haba. And now this mimer is called Efes Biltecha. It's a mimer of Shabbos Pasha Teldus, which is exactly this Shabbos, Hashgacha Pratis. This is Teldus Tafresh Tzadik Dalet. We're now Teldus Tafshin Pei Aleph, so we're talking about 81 and 6, 87 years ago. This mimer was delivered exactly on this Shabbos. So, because I'm just thinking whether we should begin from the beginning, mamish. Let me just see something. Let me see how he ends. Yeah, why not? I'll begin from the beginning because it's using the expression of this level of bittul efes biltecha. So I'll just read from the top of the page. I didn't do that by all the Mamorim and Tzadik Dal because I didn't see direct relevance. So efes biltecha goyalenu liyemesa Mashiach. So this is all from the davening, the tefillah that we say on Shabbos, in Shacharis, in the morning prayer. We say Ein arech lecha ba'elam haza, ve'ein zuloscha malkeinu ve'ein zuloscha malkeinu le'elam haba, chai elam haba. Efes biltecha goyalenu liyemesa Mashiach. So it's the third expression there. As we already learned in Ayin Beis, this is going to be a third level of bittul. So here's what the Frierdiker Rebbe says. Top of page 159. That the revelations that will be in the future, time when Mashiach comes, that's when there'll be a recognition and awareness in the contemplation, in the comprehension of the bittul of efes biltecha. So in other words, this level of bittul called efes biltecha, which means nothing biltecha without you. Ein zeloscha means nothing besides you. This means biltecha, nothing without you. He says that will be the recognition of that. In other words, in the full sense, we'll experience it. We in this world, la'asad love it. Va'oz nira. And then it will be obvious. So then it will be apparent. To who yizborach goyalenu tamid. That's the word goyalenu. That he, God, is our Redeemer always. He's always our Redeemer. In other words, it will be apparent that God is goyalenu. Dihine inyan hagolus hu b'shnei inyanim. Golus is defined by two things. Shahasheker mechas ala emes. The first thing is that sheker, deception or lies, conceal the truth. Yeah, we see that very obvious these days and always. V'asheker nidme le'emes. And the second thing is that the sheker appears to be truth. So one is it conceals the truth, and the second it deceives us into thinking that it is the truth. So one is it camouflage. She says, Shehem Beis Inyanim, the birurim unisyenis. These are two things, two levels that are called birurim. Birurim means to clarify. Nisayon is a test. So he's going to explain these two things that sheker conceals is resolved through birur, or is an element of challenge that requires birur, clarity, separation. And the second thing is the fact that sheker appears like truth is essentially a sign, a test. The bechol inyanim magashmim yesh behem nitzutz tev. All physical matter, all physical objects, everything in the physical world has in it good sparks. It has sparks, has divine good sparks. However, they're concealed, and we need avodas to reveal them. So he says, "V'klolis in hagashmi." The general gashmi. What is the nature of a gashmi? Is hu mashem sheker mechas ala emes. The sheker, meaning the physical surface that appears to us to be real, or appears to be us to be the primary reality, I should say, conceals on the sparks that are within. You know, that's why people can easily indulge and completely be self-consumed with whatever they do in Gashmis, whether it's making money or eating or sleeping or other physical activities. The sheker is mechas al emes, or lezeis, and due to that, hine haveda hu b'derech birur. So the aveda that we are that's expected of us is a b'derech birur. What's birur? V'hainu, birur means to clarify. When you mavarer birur in halacha, what is osra on Shabbos, is to separate. And birur literally means to clarify, to separate the shell from the husk from the fruit. So he says like this, V'hainu, that means litches ulahosir es hasheker, to push aside and to remove the lie, ulevarer, and to, well, levarer here would mean to what's the word? To draw out. But levarer means to clarify and reveal as hanitzutz b'chol davar gashmi kefi inyane. The spark in every physical thing, each one accordingly, each object accordingly. So, like we say in the pasuk, lo yalechem levada yichya adam, ki'im ameitze pi Hashem yichya adam. Not on bread alone does a man live, but on the meitze pi havaya, which means the fact the meitze pi havaya, the hameitze lechem, the words that come out of God's mouth, that gives the power for the earth to give us, to bring forth grain, wheat, grain that allows us to eat the lechem. So when you look at the lechem, you could say, I survive on bread. Says the pasuk, no, that's not correct. It's the meitzah piyavai, lechem levade, it's the spark, the divine spark within. So he says, so what's the Aveda? The Aveda is to reveal that, is to remove the so-called covering or husk or shell that conceals the true nature of the divine spark, the good spark within the lechem. Right. The Ayin Beis he named Mailes hanitzutz hatev. So when you separate and you reveal that spark, through this, you elevate es hanitzutz hatev, the good spark, she'ela limkeme, that it's elevates to its proper and appropriate place. If you don't do it, a person eats bread and just indulges, and there's no bracha and there's no recognition of the divine good spark inside of it, then the nitzutz is held hostage. It's trapped. When you do the right Aveda, what happens is you're actually elevating the spark and putting it back into its true prominence where it belongs. That's birur. Now comes the second thing, which was that the sheker camouflages itself as if it's true. It's more than just concealing. Concealing, okay, I remove it, now I see the truth. But what happens if the sheker itself masquerades and says, hey, I'm the truth? It says, omnam. It qualifies omnam. However, be'inyan hanisyanis, when we talk about nisyanis, so Chassidus explains that nisayin is not about birur, there's actually a reality of a spark, but nisayin is a test, it's a dimyan, like he says now. Ein behem nitzutz tev klal. In a nisayin, it's only for the gavra, it's only for the individual. There's no good spark in it altogether. The whole thing is a camouflage. When Avram was walking and he saw water before him to the Akedah, it wasn't real water. It wasn't water that he had to elevate now toward the divine. The Sultan he was being tested, so he appeared like water. There's nothing there. The whole thing is an illusion. It's not a real reality. Only your mind, it seems to be something, and that's called a test. So birur means there's actually bread, and it has a spark. The spark is concealed, so your job is to reveal. But Nesoini says, Ein bem nitzutz tev klal, v'hu rak ma she'hasheker nidma le'emes. A false reality, an illusion, is appearing to be true. And you think that this thing is really powerful, when indeed there's nothing there. The whole thing is a mirage. Al kein havedehi b'derech shvira v'tchiyah. There the Aveda is not removing the sheker and revealing a spark. There's nothing to reveal. There's no spark to reveal. There, it's b'derech shvira v'tchiyah. It's to break and shatter and push away the illusion, to realize that there's nothing there. It's not through clarifying and elevating and putting something in place. It's just simply to remove. It's like someone is like a sleight of hand that is fooling you into thinking there's a real challenge. So Chassidus is not here, but in a lot of my Maimorim talk about the difference between Nisyanis and Birurim. It's not so relevant to our whole discussion, but since he's saying it, so he's saying now this is the second element, what Elam Haza does. And of course, the Geula, Mashiach's coming, is when we will, both elements will be removed and we will see the godliness in everything, like he says, Ha'alomis v'hastadim dizman ha'golus. And due to the many concealments and coverings during the time of exile, Golus, we do not see that God is always our Redeemer. It's concealed. It's concealed. That will change in the future. That's what it says, Efes biltecha goyelenu liyemei Mashiach, that then we will see that God is Efes biltecha, nothing biltecha without you, and that you are our Redeemer all the time, goyelenu. So it appears that in the Geula, both elements will happen. The total birur and clarity and elevation of the spark, and the elimination of all the mirages and camouflages that sheker deceives us into thinking that it's emes. Okay, so fine. Now we go, and the Rebbe Friedrich Rebbe begins to summarize what we learned earlier, and then we'll go into the third Eifon of Bittul. Well, to understand this, and also to understand what is the connection between this statement we say, Efes biltecha v'goyelenu, that nothing but biltecha without you, and goyelenu, that you are our Redeemer, le'in hatfila b'chlal, v'tfila Shabbos b'frat. Why do we say this in davening? And specifically, connection, why is it connected to after Shabbos davening? So that's also going to be explained in the process here. Why we say it in davening and Shabbos davening. So he says, one needs to preface first what was explained earlier. So this is going to be a little summary of the last mimer, the last level of bittul. That the air that is drawn out and transmitted from atzmus, meaning atzmus extending and expressing through gili of oir, he says it's a level of ayin ba'atzmei. It's not just ayin because atzmus sees it as ayin. If you remember, we learned, but the ayin itself is, the bittul of ayin is in the oir itself. Oir senses this, that it is completely bottled to atzmus. Upirish ayin hu bittul. Remember, this level of ayin, the meaning is bittul, complete nullification. By contrast, the ayin of the yesh amiti is not complete nullification. It means that it's a different substance of the yesh, and it's mysterious. Ein musig, it's not understood. And it was further explained that bittul the er yesh levayre or lehevinoi, that this bittul, this selflessness or nullification of er, you can explain, ulavina, you can understand it, become a fanim, number of ways. Ha'echad, the first way, the bitla er hu al derech ha'bitl dehedet fisas makim, that the selflessness or nullification of er is like the bitl of no tfesas makim. It doesn't have any standing, doesn't sense itself as any self-contained of any value, as we explained, like this that shraga betira mayahana, like the candle in the light of the sun. Ayin Beis, the second eifon of bittul, that we can understand bittul ha'eir al derech ha'bittul de ve'ein zulascha. That the bittul is like ein zulascha. There's nothing except you, nothing zulascha besides you, and that's the bittul that we learned, that the eir itself senses that it doesn't have any mitzias existence of its own. Its entire existence is only due to its source. Those are the two levels of bittul. So that sums it up very briefly. Now comes Perek Lamed Aleph and Tzadik Daled is Lamed Aleph, and this is now introducing the third level, which we learned in the last few days in Ayin Beis. V'hinei, and now yesh eidei from the bittul. There's another type of bittul, or another type in bittul, another level or another dimension in bittul. V'hu ha'eifon hashlishi. This is a third type. This is the third type. The bitla eir. In the bitla of eir, in the nullification and selflessness of eir. The bitl zeh, this third level of bitl, who bitl elyon harbe ma bitl de ein zolascha. It's a selflessness that is very much higher, not just elyon harbe, much higher than the second level of bitl, which is called ein zolascha. Okay, that's the opening statement. In Ayin Beis, it was also, he started with that, I believe. Yeah. It's a level that's higher, very much higher. The bitl de ein zolascha, the bitl number 2, level 2, that ein zolascha, there's nothing besides you. Hu mashenegeya ba mitziyah shalei. As we learned, this is negay in the mitzias of Eir. That the mitzias of Eir, not just like the first level, is not the mitzias of the Eir is affected. It's just that in the light, in the presence of a higher light, the light feels itself completely nullified. Like a candle in the light of the sun. The candle itself is not transformed. It remains a candle. This bitl, however, is in the mitzias of Eir. Eir itself is an existing entity, but what kind of an existence is it? Not just it's nullified in the presence of something greater, it itself senses and feels through and through that it's completely dependent on the source. You don't say that by a candle. The candle is not dependent on sunlight. And neither is the student or the Chacham Kotten is not dependent on the Chacham Gadol, even if he was a student. He's nullified in his presence. But here the Eir is the Mitzvah Shalai. So he goes on. The Be'inyan ha'Eir hu mashe bilodei ha'atzmus ein Mitzvah Eir. What does that mean? That Eir is constantly aware that without Atzmus, there's no existence of Eir. That would be like if the candle sense that there's no candle without sunlight. Obviously, that doesn't make any sense, but that would be the equivalent. So the Eir senses without Atzmus, there's no Eir. V'hainu. And this means the Mitzias Eir v'adei Atzmus dafka. That the very existence, the entire existence of Eir is only due to Atzmus. It doesn't have any other reality. However, he's setting the stage here to explain the power and the superiority of level 3, of the third type of bittul. So he says, the Mekom Mokim Yesh Mitzvah She'enei Atzmus. This, however, means that there's a Mitzvah that's not Atzmus. No, Eir is not Atzmus. Rak she'Mitzvah Su'adei Atzmus. It's an existence whose Mitzvah is due to Atzmus. So it wouldn't exist without Atzmus, but you can't call it, it's not synonymous with Atzmus. Atzmus is the source, or beyond being a source. Atzmus is Atzmus. Atzmus, who is Kol Yachol, can do anything he wishes, chooses to create the concept of revelation, chooses to create the idea of awareness, of revealing. Atzmus is not defined by Gili. He's not defined by Helam nor by Gili, beyond both. So Oyer, as soon as there's Oyer, Atzmus has essentially decided to create, to emanate, or emit, I should say, a Mitzias of Oyer. But this Mitzias is completely bottled and knows it doesn't have any reality of its own. It's only due to its source. The Yesh is also from Atzmus, but the Yesh doesn't know that. That would be the distinction between Eir and Yesh, as we learned. So this is still level 2. So Mitzias. So you see right away the Frierdiker Rebbe is adding words to explain what it says in Ayin Beis. In Ayin Beis, I believe the language there was, no, it actually says the Mekom Mokim Yesh Mitzias She'ena Atzmus, like Mitzias She'adei Atzmus. This is still the language of Ayin Beis, sorry. But there's going to be more explanation now on that. Okay. The Mekom Mokim Yesh Mitzias She'en Mitzias, like Mitzias She'adei Atzmus. The inyan habitl hurak bezeh ma she'ena mitzias la'atzmei. This now begins the Frierdiker Rebbe's explanation. So what does the bitl consist of? That it's only in the fact that it's a mitzias, but it's not a mitzias of its own. In other words, it has no standing of its own. Its whole mitzias is due to atzmos. Asher bezehu yisron habitl be'efon habeis, shu habitl de'en zuloscha, legabe habitl be'efon ha'alef, shu habitl de'hedet tfisas mokim. So this you see now, the Frierdiker Rebbe is really going to help explain all the difference between 1, 2, and 3. We'll get back to 3 soon, but he wants to go back to 1 and 2, because once you know that, you can, by contrast, understand what the third level is like. So now he goes back. So this bitl is why there is a mitzias, it's called oir. But it says, ein mitzias la'atzmei. And this is actually the quality and the advantage of level 2 compared to level 1. This is this Yisrael habitl, the second, the bitl of ein zuloscha. There's none other than you. Compared to the bitl of the first type, which was the bitl of lack of standing, meaning head that fits makim, that's nullified in the presence of its source. What's the strength? What's the advantage of 2 over 1? Of the second type over the first type? So he's going to explain. That bitl, the head that fits makim, level 1, where it's like the candle in the light of the sun. So oir, in the presence of, and sensing, we said dovuk, it's connected and is aware of its source, so it's completely nullified. She says, the bitl of hedet tfisas mokim ein negei be'etzem hametzias shalei. We learned this, but he's spelling it out. That doesn't affect the actual oir. It affects the oir's so-called function, the oir's value. That when you're standing in front of a greater chacham, you don't have light to give off that has any value, because his light overshadows yours. The sunlight overshadows the candlelight. So the candle has no value, but doesn't mean the candle doesn't exist. So it's not negei be'etzem b'mitzias shalei, in the actual mitzias of oir. It's only in oir's relationship with the source, and therefore doesn't have any value. That's why, for example, you don't see the moon or the stars by day, because the sunlight is the dominant one. When the sun is not there, they're there. They exist in heaven, but it's not seen, except in certain circumstances. But so it's not pshat the moon and the stars are affected by the sunlight. They just don't have a function. They're not seen, and therefore, for all practical purposes, they're invisible. They didn't disappear. So it doesn't affect the mitzias of the oir in the nimshal. Ki'im b'ispashtus b'ispashtus levad. Rather, its effect is only in its expression. It's an extension in its spreading out. The spreading out of light has no value and has nothing at all, just like the candle has no ispashtus. But not the mitzias of the candle is diminished. Its ispashtus is essentially nullified. V'gam zeh, not only is it not affect the mitzias, he's going further. V'gam zeh rak l'shah. And even this nullification is only temporary. It's only during that time when the greater source, the greater light, or in this case, the source, is present. V'hainu explains what that means now. The rak l'shah mizbat lo ispashtus. It's only for l'shah means for an hour, but l'shah in Hebrew means for a temporary period, meaning a certain limited period. That only during that period, mizbat la ispashtus salei, its extension, its expression is nullified. Using exactly that example. Like the bitl, the nullification of the light of a candle in comparison to the light of the sun. The bitl of the candle is only in its expression, and it's in its function. That it's not recognized. It's not obvious. It's not apparent. You don't see the light of the candle when there's the light of the sun. So number one, it doesn't affect its very mitzias of the candle. And it's only temporary, like he says now, Bishkiyas Achama, when the sun sets, Ha'er Nikir, the light of the candle will become very apparent. As a matter of fact, it will illuminate your way. So the same candle is burning. Now it's middle of the day. You don't even see it. You don't notice it. As the sun sets, that same candle continuing to burn. Now suddenly has his pashtus again. So besides the fact that it doesn't affect it fundamentally, the candle doesn't cease to exist. Even the nullification is only temporary. Oi, and he's going back to the second example that Rebbe Rashab gave. Like a wise person who doesn't speak in front of someone who's greater than him. Same idea. He doesn't speak not because he doesn't have chachma, it doesn't cease to exist. It's because his speaking, the spashtus, is nullified in the presence of someone greater than him, whose ayr is much, much greater. Ayr or the mokir, however you define it. And it's also the shah. Once he's not in the presence of the chacham gadol, he will speak and will teach. So now the Frierdiker Rebbe goes further. The be'emes, because in truth be told, he's going further now. Remember, this is all explaining level 1 and the advantage of level 2 over level 1. We haven't gotten to 3 yet. We just began. It says, now the truth is, the bittul is not just in its etzem etzias. Till now we said the candle's actual existence is not affected by the sunlight. Its expression is affected. Now he's saying, it's also not affecting even the very core of his pashtus. And the reason, I'll just explain it, because he's going to explain, but the reason is very simple, because if a moment later, once the sun sets, the candle is shining, so even this pashtus was not really affected. It was affected for that moment. It's not like, for example, let's for instance say that the candle, because it's in the light of the sun, it's so nullified that it can't even bring itself to continue to shine even when the sun is not there. Let's say a chacham is standing in front of his great master, or a chacham she'eleh. So you could say he's not just nullified then, but even when his master leaves, or when the greater chacham is no longer there, he became so bottled, he can't speak. But that's not the case. So you have to say that even when the pashtus was compromised, was concealed, because of the greater, it's not because the pashtus fundamentally the candle can't shine. It's right now, it's silent. The chacham is silent just for that period of time. So it's not just that the mitzias is not impacted, and it's not, and it's only temporary. It means that this pashtus also fundamentally was not compromised. It wasn't like you lose your identity and ability to speak, because as soon as the other greater chacham is no longer there, as soon as the sun sets, the light shines without any effort, even just shines. So it tells you that the effect is there. And we learned I explained that in volume 1, he explained that a bittul of headed physis mokum, this first level, also affects the entity. Because look, at the end of the day, I don't know about a candle, because it's not human, but the chacham, he's, I'm sure, impacted. Even after the chacham gadol leaves, he's impacted. But not to the point that he doesn't teach. So we learned that it does affect, but at the end of the day, it's not a fundamental at the core essence of the entity of Oyer, that it is completely in that state of non-existence. So therefore, and now he's going to explain. So even these pashtus is also ukanal b'moshel, like we learned earlier in the moshel. This was Perek Chav Ches, chapter 28, back on page. Remember the moshel that he gave of the ministers and the king. That were there. They're great leaders and they control the whole empire. But when they're in the presence of the king, they become nullified. So this was back on, just to tell you the page, 137, 138. 138. Yeah. Okay. So what do we learn in the mashal? The Sari HaMelucha, the mashal of the ministers of the king. Next page, 160. Ba'amdam lifnei HaMelech. When they're in the state, when they're in the presence, standing before the king. Harim is batlin beheaded tfisas makim. They become nullified by lack of standing. They're standing in front of the king, all the qualities they have, and all the power they yield, and everything about them is become like the candle in the light of the sun. Ubavoyim them came on. But when they return to their positions and their posts, nothing changed. They go back to the way they were before they stood in the presence of the king, with the full authority of whatever their position or post is in the kingdom. Im Kain. So what do we derive from this? If that's the case, he's summing up this first. So the klolos habitl, this general nullification or selflessness, is only in its extension, and we also learn not fundamentally, but in its extension, and only temporary. Okay, Mashen Kain ba bitl defen Beis. The second eifin, the second type of bitl, by contrast, is not that way. Shabitl negei ba mitzia shalei. Now the bitl is negei, it touches the very core of the existence of the oir. Till now, it didn't affect the candle itself. The level one, I should say. Upoil boy chekike pnimis. It's an interesting expression. And it impacts it. It impacts with a chekike pnimis, an internal engraving. It's like someone engraving something. It's not a superficial effect. It's not just the effect of hispastus, which after the sun sets, the candle is exactly at full strength. This causes a chekike pnimis. It means it penetrates and pierces inward. It's an inward piercing. Ukanal bariches. Ukanizbar le'il bariches, as it was explained earlier at length in the Rebbe Tzechen's same chapter, 28. I'm looking at the footnote below. What was explained at length? Remember? How is that bittul level 2 in the Nivroim? Tzva Shamayim, Tzva Haaretz, and Tzva Shamayim. The Kol Inyan Kima Mitzias V'chayis and Nivroim. The entire very existence, very sustenance and existence, and energy. 3 languages use Kiyum, Hametzias V'chayis and Nivroim. The very holding together, the Kiyum, the sustaining of existence. And Chayis and Nivroim, and the energy within all the creations or creatures. It's only due to God's will. You take away God's will, everything either perishes or is in a state of decay, as we learned. So what's that? So what is this different than level 1? Level 1, that's not the case. In bittul 1, level type 1, bittul type 1, the candle continues to be a candle just during the period when it's standing in front of the presence of something greater. Here, oir, even if it's not in the presence, so to speak, even though that doesn't make sense because oir is always in the presence, but it means the very existence of the oir senses it has no existence of its own. It's only dependent on the source all the time. It's not lefisha, it's not temporary, and it's not just in hispastus. It's not just that the oir says, I can't shine because someone greater is shining. I don't exist without the source. So it's a sense of complete recognition of it being only due to its source. He doesn't elaborate more, but that's what he says. And in Nivroim, it's the contemplation that we come to realize that our existence, and especially our kiyum, the orbit, if you remember the orbit, the movements and so on, is due to a higher force. And without that higher force, existence would not perpetuate. So now he went back to explain bittul type 2 over bittul type 1. But now he's going to say, but something is still there's a deeper level now. Omnam, la'achar kol zeh, after all of this, hari mekol mokim, nevertheless, yesh ne'ezim mitzias. Oyer still has some existence. It doesn't say it doesn't exist. It just says its existence is completely aware and recognizes that it's due to its source. And without the source, it doesn't exist. In level 1, it's not due to its source. Here it is, but it's still in existence. You don't say there's no Oyer. You say the Oyer is there, but it's completely aware and cognizant of its existence being only due to its source. It exists. However, its existence is through its source. The yesh doesn't have that. The yesh exists, but it doesn't feel a source. The senses its source. So the exists, yesh exists. The difference is that yesh doesn't have bitl on its own, and does have bitl on its own. The bitl that yesh has is through avodah, as we've learned. It's through mekayde. Va'efen hagimel. Now comes the third type, bitl type 3. The third efen, the inyan habitl, the inyan of bitl and nullification and selflessness, hu shagam ima atzmus. Not just without atzmus I don't exist, but even with atzmus, lo yesh rak bechinas atzmus. There's nothing but atzmus. So the oyer doesn't sense I'm a mitzias that's completely dependent, and without atzmus I don't exist, but even with atzmus, I don't exist. In other words, there's no sense of mitzias altogether. The only thing is that it's an expression of atzmus. It's like, that's all it is. We need more explanation, obviously. I gave some explanation. Hopefully now we're going to learn more about this. But that's what he says. That's the same language that was word for word from Ayin Beis. For who? And this is habitl de madregas efes biltecha. This bitl type 3, this is the bitl of the level efes biltecha, nothing without you. And I've explained the difference between zoloscham biltecha. Zoloscham means nothing besides you, and this is nothing without you. I hope he'll explain it more in the language. If not, I will, but let's just continue reading now. As I said, there's going to be a lot of discussion now about this. This is right now back to the language of Ayin Beis for a few more lines, and then the Friedrich Rebbe goes further. Okay. Shagam ima atzmus ein mitzias er klal. That even with atzmus, it's not just I can't exist without atzmus, but even when atzmus is also ein er mitzias er klal. There's no existence of er. Ki ima atzmus levad. The only thing that's sensed is atzmus itself. So it's not an existence that completely bottled to atzmus. You don't even feel the bittul, so to speak. It's just expression of atzmus is the best way to explain these words. Ubir dovazehu. It's interesting. The Friedrich Rebbe now changes the language. Friedrich Rebbe Rashab said yesh levayzeh, according to the Shari Yichud Vamuna. The Friedrich Rebbe says ubir dovazehu. Like I've said a number of times, what a yesh lamer by the Rebbe Rashab becomes a vadai by the Friedrich Rebbe, which is of course understood. So yesh levai means you could explain it, and the Friedrich Rebbe just says ubir davazeh. This is the explanation. What
like
is the
explanation? The Rebbe Rashab is writing a lot v'chulei v'chulei v'chulei. So I think I sent the Rishim as one of the biurim that Tzemach Tzedek one time gave a whole explanation. And then somebody said that this is the explanation. So the Tzemach Tzedek said, Petach, you think that this is whole? There is so much more to say. So, but the Rebbe Rashab, it was enough to say that even if he explained everything very much, but there is more to explain about it. So, but the Friedrich Rebbe was the Rebbe Rashab said, "V'yesh is a biur."
The Rebbe Yud Shvat Tov Shelamed Zayin spoke about the chulus of the Rebbe Rashab. He said that he's never heard a reason for it, but you see in the Rebbe Rashab's Mamorim, Yud Shvat Lamed Zayin, you see a lot of so many chulus, And more importantly, the Rebbe said, and he said, when the Rebbe the Shver, the Frierdiker Rebbe, cited an extreme word for word, the Rebbe Rashab, he crossed out with his pencil, he crossed out all the chulus. So in other words, he didn't want the chulu. That means it was designated specifically the Rebbe Rashab, Me'ezah Sibba. The Rebbe doesn't say the reason. He also said by the Mittler Rebbe, the language is Vidal, Vidai Lemevin. The Mittler Rebbe uses Vidal very often. The Rebbe just said it as a statement of fact. He didn't explain. Now, when he crossed out, so in other words, when I say crossed out, he didn't cross out his father's chulu. It's when he rewrote the Maimer and he gave it to Amaitik, he said, don't put the chulus in, basically. So it was very clear that it could be because the Rebbe Rashab is the Rambam of Chassidus. So essentially, he's always saying chulu, there's more. And the Frierdiker Rebbe, I mean, you could verbring about it. But anyway, so he says now this, Ubir Dover Zeh. What's the explanation of this concept that we're talking, that even ima atzmus emetzius er klal? Whereas in level 2, you say beli atzmus, there's no er. But with atzmus, there's a metzius of er. There's something there. So he's going to explain Ubir Dover Zeh. Explanation of this is, and this is quoting again from Ayin Beis, the be'inyan bitlan evreim kosav rabbeinu nishmosei eden. That about bitl of Nevroim, he's going back to Nevroim now, not Ur. But the nullification or the lack of true reality of creations, Nevroim, the creatures. Says the Alter Rebbe, Rabbeinu Nishmos Eden very often, even though the Rebbe calls the Rebbe Rashab Admur Nishmos Eden, Frierdiker Rebbe is the Rebbe de Shver, Admur Nishmos Eden, but by Rabbeim, when they write Rabbeinu Nishmos Eden, generally it's the Alter Rebbe. Even though it wasn't the previous or two or their grandfathers, it was the Rebbe the Frierdiker Rebbe quotes Rebbe Marash will write Kveit Kedushas Azmur, which means Admur Avi Zizkeni, meaning my grandfather. But when it comes to the Alter Rebbe, very often they write Admur Rabbeinu Nishmos Eden. Where does he write it? Chelik Beis Perek Aleph. He doesn't even say the word Tanya here. In Ayin Beis, he says Sefer Shalbeinim Chelik Beis. Here, the Frierdiker Rebbe just writes Chelik Beis Perek Aleph. He's referring to Shar Yechad Vamunah, the second section of Tanya. So, as I said, we learned this, but we're reading it now again through the lens of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and there's Hesofis, a lot of Hesofis. So, just 2 days ago, we learned it in Ayin Beis. So this is not new material, but it's new. We'll do it again and with more explanation. So what does the Alter Rebbe say about Bittul HaNevroim in the first chapter of Shar Yichud V'Amunah? Hineksiv le'elam Hashem dvar chenitzu b'shamayim. It says, this is a Lashon HaTanya, right in the beginning of Perek Aleph. It says, le'elam Hashem dvar chenitzu b'shamayim. Forever the words of God, nitzav, are embedded, or they stand upright, or they're holding up Shamayim, Nitzav b'Shamayim. They're ingrained in Shamayim. Upirish Baal Shem Tov Zal. And Baal Shem Tov interprets this as follows. The Rebbe says, the Frierdiker Rebbe teaches, the Rebbe says, it's actually a Medrash Tilim that teaches Le'el Hashem Tvorchem Nitzav b'Shamayim, that the Eibush is constantly recreating the world. So they ask, why is it in a Pirish Baal Shem Tov? So they teach you Pirish from the word Farnante Gespreit. Pirish can mean he interprets. It also can mean Pirish from the word he spread it out. He disseminated it. He made it popular. That's what it says in this Farim. Another just interesting footnote. The beginning of Shar Yichud V'Amunah is always said in Chitas. You know what day? Shavuos, the yahrzeit of the Baal Shem Tov. Both in Hashanah Muberes and in a regular year. In a leap year and a regular year. Frierdiker Rebbe, when he was Machalik Chitas, Tanya, so he made that pay the beginning of Shar Yichud V'Amunah has Pirush Baal Shem Tov in it. The Rebbe says because it's the yahrzeit of the Baal Shem Tov. So he says, so what does the Baal Shem Tov teach or spreads? Kidvorcha she'amarta yehi rakia b'teich hamayim. The words that you uttered, that you said, meaning you Hashem, in the Torah. The second, what does it say? Yehi rakia b'teich hamayim. God said there shall be a heaven, a firmament within the water. The whole world was covered in water. First day was Yehi Oyer. The second day Yehi Rakia. She says those words that you said, teaches the Baal Shem Tov, Hariteves ve'esius elu. These words and these letters. So it's both they're letters that make up words. These teves ve'esius elu hey nitzoves ve'emdes la'elam b'teich rakia shamayim. They're permanently standing upright. Nitzoves means strong. Nitzav melech, very upright. Emdes standing up. La'elam forever b'teich rakia shamayim. Within the firmament in heaven, meaning in the sky. Umuluboshes b'teich kol harakim la'elam lahachesam. And this divine words, dvarcha, yihirakia b'teich hamayim, is miluboshes. They're enclosed, they're manifest within all the heavens, all the atmospheres. Lahachesam, I'm sorry, to energize them. Kidiksiv, like it says, V'dvar Elokeinu yokum le'elam. V'dvarav chayim v'kayomim la'ad. That the word of God, yokum le'elam, stands forever. So the Pashta Pshat, people say, God's word is eternal. God's word is not like a human words are temporary, and God's words are eternal, le'elam. But here is teaching deeper. Yokum le'elam means they're not just eternal. They're eternally embedded in the thing they're creating to sustain it all the time. They're living and persevering, or perpetuating is the word I wanted, la'ad, forever. Why? He continues. Chulu. The chulu is in the, because he's not using all the language of Tanya here. Because if these letters would be removed, they would, istalkus means removed, they would expire, be removed for 1 second, even for a second. Interesting, chaz v'shalom. People, what's a chaz v'shalom? Because chaz v'shalom, the whole existence would cease to be. And the Eibishter doesn't want the existence to cease to be. That's how they tie it chaz v'shalom. Because chaz v'shalom, usually you say a navera, chaz v'shalom, or danger, or something, a dangerous thing. But here he's teaching it that if these letters of God's words would be removed, kerega, a split second even, the chezes lemkedam, and they would return to their source. In other words, I'm speaking right now, my words are coming out of my mouth, but let's say I stop speaking, and what happens to the power of language? Goes back inside me. It recedes back. So that's what he's saying, that if God stopped speaking, and the words were not emanating from him, and goes back to their source, meaning within God. Before he said Yehirakia, how you call Hashemayim Ayin Beis Mamish, entire heaven, that would become Ayin Beis Mamish. Ayin means nullified, Efes means complete zero. It's like Ein Zoloscha and Efes Biltacha, but he says Ayin Beis Mamish. And it would, as kaloi means as if it never existed. Completely disappear. Not even a ration. You could say maybe some trace, something. No, kaloi hayu klal. Exactly as it be, as if the maimer, as it was before Hashem said Yehirakia. Even human beings, you say something to somebody, even if you stop speaking, they remember what you said. The words still could have impact. They don't create, but the words can still reverberate and have its effect, echo, so to speak, inside of you. Many of us remember words people told us, for good or for bad, years later. But here, if the words go back and recede back into the source, everything disappears as if it never happened. You could say it happened, but it disappears. He says, no, as if it never happened. This is Shayach V'Amunah. There's no Hisofa yet. The Frierdiker Rebbe is quoting more of the Shayach V'Amunah than the Rebbe Rasha, but not much more. But this is the long Losh. So Kodim Maimer Yirakia Mamish. And he adds Mamish. He could have just said Kodim Maimer Yirakia, he says Mamish, to make sure, emphasize as if it never happened. That's how much existence is dependent on its source. That's the point here. That's how much the rakia, everything in existence, is so dependent. It's not just letters and words that are giving it energy. They're giving it its very existence. And remove it, everything stops. As if, and it's actually retroactive, frankly. That's what he's saying. As if it never existed.
So, Rabbi Jacobson, so that would mean that it wouldn't mean that the person just stops existing, saying they talk about existence of an individual, but that their whole life never existed. So then you would have to totally rewrite history, because that person would all the effects that person had on everybody else that they ever had, and since their moment they were conceived, would have to be nullified also, wouldn't it? Would you? Everybody's thing, change one person, you change the entire world. If that person didn't exist ever, so I never related to my third grade teacher, and I never had this accident, and everything changes.
Okay, well, 2 points. First of all, this is talking about existence purely by its own firepower, that it doesn't have any firepower of its own. Remember, the same Eibishter wants existence to be, and he infuses it with meaning. The point of the Alter Rebbe is not to say that existence doesn't have any significance, because when you add Nesava Kodesh Baruch Hu Liyis Baruch Dira B'Tachtenim, he wants this existence. He wants your third grade teacher, he wants you, and he wants life. This is really coming to establish that existence is only dependent on God. And with God, yes, everything has significance. Take away God, yes, your relationship with your third grade teacher is meaningless. And more than meaningless, it's like it never happened. What value does it have? Who gave it value in the first place? The only value it has is because God gave it value and continues to give it. And he will continue. It doesn't say anywhere the Eibishter is going to remove his words. The Alter Rebbe is coming to tell us that the whole existence that you're living and all your relationships take away the godly energy, and it's as if it never happened retroactively. That's how insignificant it is. But let's talk the second half. The fact that God does want it, and he does keep saying Yehirakia, means he's renewing the contract, and he wants to renew it. We don't have anywhere it says that God ever removed the letters. Even when God wanted to destroy the world, the Mabul, he didn't remove Yehirakia. He took a Mabul, he brought water, and destroyed the life on earth. You never find that even once in history that God should do this. That tells you something. So the Alter Rebbe is not trying to create a type of apocalyptic scenario like in a science fiction movie where poof, everything disappears and history disappears. He's trying to explain how existence has no validity without God. But with God, of course, every mitzvah we do, every good deed, and for that matter, every bad deed is significant. You go with this approach, you could say anything I do makes no difference, because if God removes his words, the whole thing will never have happened. So every crime I did will also disappear. See, so you have to distinguish between the two. But yes, hypothetically, if God, in this hypothetical that God chooses to determine that he doesn't want existence anymore, then why do you think a third grade teacher has any significance, nor you or I? It all disappears. That's true, because we have no standing of our own. Remember, the scientific way of looking at the world is I exist, and maybe there's a God that put me here. Maybe. Chassidus says the exact opposite. God exists, and the question is, what are we doing here? So it's really completely understanding Bitlan Nevroim. But the interesting paradox is that once God does give validity, it's far more valid than if we give validity. Just because I have a big ego doesn't mean I'm real. It just means I feel I'm real. But once God says you hear Rakia, then you can rest assured that this Rakia has divine truth to it, because he wants it there, but not due to its own credit, but only due because God is giving it that. So that's how I would phrase it.
Could we say that this is like a screen of a video that is shining, let's say, letters, Aleph, let's say, and really, if the whole entire video, the whole entire screen would shine, you wouldn't see anything. But since it shines only this spot, it's an Aleph. But really, this is only what it shines. It looks to us like there is something, but really it's not this. So the same thing in the world, it seems to us like an aleph, like we are existing, but really it's not us, it's Hashem. It's correct?
Some people explain Shari Yichud V'Amunah like that. I think Yecheskel Sefer explains it in his explanation on Tanya. There are different explanations, yeah. You need a lot of mashalim for this, because at the end of the day, it really comes down to that when you say Eneid Mulvade and Eneid, that existence on one hand exists, but on the other hand is completely divine. The Alter Rebbe will later say in Shaykh V'Amunah that the Tzimtzum, Nikra Kalim, we spoke about this, that God does want, existence is not an illusion. So it's important to remember it's not an illusion either. But you know, I don't want to go into the whole subject of Shaykh V'Amunah now, because it deserves its own explanation. The point he wants to make here, and we'll stop here after this because I see it's already the time. The point he wants to make here, let me just see where we'll stop. Yeah, it's a good place to stop, the mamish. He wants to obviously explain Oyer, how Oyer, the third type of the bittul in Oyer, is Efes Biltecha, where there's no Metzias altogether. The whole thing is Atzmos. So he's using an explanation that the whole existence, like Shemarakia, Shemayim, it's not a heaven, it's divine words. But at the same time, it doesn't mean heaven is an illusion. It just means that we're not seeing the divine energy. So that's why we don't see the energy. Like, you know, when you look at a computer screen and you see letters, we all know it's zeros and ones being organized a certain way that creates the language that we ultimately, through all the interfaces, ends up being, you press an aleph or an A, becomes an A on the screen. Now, let's just imagine existence is that way, that the whole world, not just on a computer screen, when you actually write an aleph with your pen, all it is really a divine DNA or divine zeros and ones that are really behind the scene. It just, the garment that it carries is an aleph and a beis. And the garment has value because God wants it to have value. Yehira Ki is not Yehi Oyer. And Yehira Ki is not Teitz Eretz Desha. It's not Nas Adam B'Tzalmenu. An Adam is not a heaven. Everything has its own identity. But each one is divine words that are different permutations or different letters. This one says Nasa Adam. This is Yehira Kia. It's different zeros and ones, basically. So if you really want to understand the reality of it, you have to know that it's really zeros and ones that to us, in the physical world, that's what is a Shemayim. Shemayim is a 0 and 1 of God, basically, in a certain order. Obviously, when I say 0, 1, I mean Reish, Kuf, Yud, Ayin, Yehi, Rakia. That is, so we're going to learn more about it. I think we stop here. And the point he wants to make is, what is this existence? Is it Elikus or is it a heaven? He wants to say it's Elikus. And then he's going to bring this back to Oyer, that even though there's Oyer, but it's not a Metzias of Oyer, it's only Atzmos. That's what he wants to ultimately explain, the third type of bittul. It's a lot to talk about, a lot to unpack. Even Shari Yichud V'Amunah alone, you could spend a lot of time in trying to understand exactly what's going on there. But let's suffice for now. I'm not suggesting it's all, we've exhausted the topic. We'll talk more about it. And so we're on middle here, page 160 in Sadik Daled, talking about